Welcome, everybody, to this event. This is an event of the James and Catherine Stone Foundation initiative, which really looks at the implications of great wealth for American society. We talk about it as being explorations on the dark side of the Gilded Age. It's an initiative I run with Margot Finn that has faculty and student fellows. Today, I'm delighted to present a conversation between three books that I very much admire. We all very much admire. They're unusual for academic books. They tell you something fresh. They're meticulously researched, and they're really fun to read. That's the unusual part. In a sense, I have to apologize to the three panelists. Their books are so interesting that for each one of them, we could do easily a 90-minute session on the book, as you'll see when they begin to talk. But we thought bringing them together in one day on one panel would really help to demonstrate the extraordinary reach of great wealth of the contemporary Gilded Age, that the many different pieces of society, the corners of society that great wealth has touched. And as you'll see, three very, very different books, and yet in some ways, very much the same theme, how wealth has changed our politics, our society, our culture, the ways we interact with one another. So let's turn right to the books. I will first introduce Shamus. Ashley, I'll ask you to great, thank you. Shamus Khan is a professor of sociology and American studies at Princeton University. He's the author of over 100 articles and books, essays, book reviews, including the book we're going to be talking about today, Privilege, The Making of an Adolescent Elite at St. Paul's School, a book published by Princeton University Press, The Practice of Research, published by Oxford, The Approaches of Ethnography, again an Oxford book, and one last book, or I'll start to embarrass Professor Khan, Sexual Citizens, Sex, Power, and Assault on Campus, published by Norton and named by NPR a best book of 2020. Shamus, welcome to Brown. It's really a delight to have you here, and take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you to you and to Margaret and to everyone at the Watson Institute for making this possible. I want to thank my co-author on some projects, Ashley and Margot, for joining in the conversation. I'm going to dive right in, and what I'm going to do in the next 15 minutes or so is to just give a kind of quick overview and feel for the argument of privilege, and then put it into the context of some other sorts of work that I've done. And the focus is going to be primarily on sort of cultural understandings of elites. So today, I want to start with just sort of two stories. The first is back in 1993, when I was a rather young and immature 14-year-old or so, and I first stepped onto the campus of St. Paul's School. I was a student, and when I arrived on school grounds, I was kind of surprised by what I saw, because in the dormitory that I'd been assigned to, I was surrounded by Black and Latino boys. Of the 22 of us in the dorm, I think 5 were white. And this isn't really what I expected when I went to a place like St. Paul's. Now, you kind of need to know something about St. Paul's to know why that wasn't expected. And it's that St. Paul's has long been associated with wealth and power in American society. It has an endowment of well over $500 million. It only has 500 students. In the 60s, John Kerry went to St. Paul's. He lived and played on the hockey team with Robert Mueller, who was the person who investigated Trump and ran the FBI. They also lived with a guy named Ed Pillsbury, heir to the Pillsbury Dough fortune, and Gary Trudeau, who the cartoonist of Doonesbury, which is named in half part after Ed Pillsbury. So you sort of have, a presidential candidate, head of the FBI, person who eventually will investigate Trump. I'll just note that the person who did the Watergate investigation, Archibald Cox, also went to St. Paul's, as well as an heir to a major American fortune and a cartoonist who kind of defined for a generation political cartoons and political insights. So as you might imagine, I didn't think about this as potentially being in a tremendously diverse place. And when I left my dormitory and started to walk around campus, I quickly realized that it was not a terribly diverse place. Instead, what happened at St. Paul's was that all of the minority students lived in the same dorm, or they lived in one of two dorms. And this wasn't something that the school was proud of. It wasn't something the school even tried to do. In fact, years before I had arrived, a few years before, the school had tried to break up the minority student dorm, but the students in the following year, in constructing their housing preferences, basically conveyed, like, thanks but no thanks. You know, the distance between Spanish Harlem and the Upper East Side may be a matter of blocks, but the social distance was simply too great for students. And so you had this tremendous segregation at the place. Fast forward a little bit more than a decade, and I returned to the school as a researcher to do my dissertation research. And while I was there, I sat down with a kid. In the book, I call him Chase Abbott, who I asked the same question that I asked every single student that I spoke to. I said, how did you end up at a place like St. Paul's? And when I asked this question, Chase got really kind of mad at me and turned the question around and said, how did you end up here? And it was kind of his way to sort of say to me, like, who are you to ask me, Chase Abbott, how I ended up here when, and he proceeded to tell me a long history of Abbott men and eventually Abbott women, since the school went co-ed in the early 1970s, who had attended St. Paul's. And he kind of conveyed to me that I couldn't understand the history of the institution without understanding people like Chase Abbott. In the book, Chase serves as kind of a Bourdieusian character. So he's the person who Bourdieu would kind of predict might be super comfortable at the place. And yet, when Chase asked me this, I kind of had to chuckle because Chase was sitting in my office, in part because he was struggling at the institution. He wasn't doing particularly well. And he lived in a dorm with a bunch of other kids like him. Kids who all came from pretty well-established families in American life and who had long associations with the institution, yet who no longer really belonged, who kind of constructed this narrative in the way that Chase did, but were seen somehow as illegitimate for it. Now, I use this because it tells us about two moments of segregation, two moments where a group of people are somehow isolated within the institution. In one, you have this degree of racial isolation, and in the second, it's a class isolation. But it's important to note that there were lots of other rich kids at St. Paul's, many, many, many others who were not like Chase Abbott. And Chase serves to me as a way to describe the transformation in the culture of American elites, or at least the culture of Northeastern elites who go to boarding school, from entitlement to privilege. And what I argue in the book is that whereas elites in the past were entitled, building their worlds around the right breeding, connections, and cultures, new elites have developed privilege, a sense of self and mode of interaction that advantages them. That these new elites tend to de-emphasize refined tastes or who you know, and instead they highlight how you act in and approach the world. This is a very particular approach to being an elite, a fascinating combination of contemporary cultural mores and classic American values. The story that this new elite ends up telling us is really built on America's belief that merit and hard work will pay off. And it harnesses a kind of 21st century global outlook, absorbing and sort of extracting value from everything, always savvy to what's happening at the present. Part of the way in which institutions like St. Paul's and the Ivy League tell their story is to look less and less like an exclusive yacht club and more like a microcosm of our diverse worlds, albeit microcosms with very particular social rules. Now, I'm not so naive as to think that there is a kind of, that these people are actually accurate in their descriptions of what it is that they are. And so in the work, I make a distinction between the kind of saying of meritocracy that the new elite do, which is to say that they're there not because of their long-term associations with the institutions, but instead because of their own hard work and diligence. So that's sort of a verbal commitment to aristocracy, but there is, on the other hand, a doing of privilege. And the doing of privilege suggests this sort of new inequality, which is that, sort of, if we think about inequality, the explanations that we tend to fall back on are about resource hoarding. So why is there inequality? Well, there can be lots of reasons, but in contemporary capitalism, one of the ones might be that there are resources and that people hoard access to those resources, and they extract rents from their capacity to do that hoarding. But if we look at institutions over the last 50 years, particularly elite institutions, resource hoarding is real. Princeton had a $10 or $11 billion return on its endowment last year, which is absurd. But at the same time, the institution looks increasingly open. And so how do we make sense of an increasingly open elite within conditions of increasing inequality? In other words, how do we make sense of how openness and inequality go together? And I think that the answer to this puzzle is really important for making sense of why it is that there's a particular kind of culture to the contemporary elite. In other words, the civil rights movement's fights 50 years ago, 70 years ago, argued for access. And the elite have largely responded to this. I think we would be hard pressed to find a Fortune 500 company that did not have a DEI statement. And that's sort of astonishing to think about. And elites no longer explicitly and intentionally build sort of racial and gendered moats, nor do they rely upon narratives of entitlement. Something new and different is going on, and we need to better understand it. Now, in order to do this, I kind of give an ethnographic portion of a year in my life there when I worked as a teacher, and I sort of observed what life was like. And, what I saw was that on the one hand, kids ended up embodying a kind of ease. And so ease is my sort of American translation for Bourdieu's word habitus. So it's sort of an embodied sense of dispositions. And I noted how the kids often treated hierarchies like ladders, not ceilings. So the idea was that hierarchical relationships were actually things that weren't seen as unsettling or something that were problematic within the world. Instead, where hierarchies were problems was when they created ceilings. But if you could treat them like ladders, if you could treat them as things that allowed for the possibility of mobility, then they weren't necessarily such a bad, terrible thing. And what I heard again and again was people talk about how hierarchies were ladders, how they worked hard to get ahead, how, basically, and that was really grounded in their own experience. Kids who acted like Chase Abbott, who basically said that they should get advantages because they got older or because they knew someone else at the institution, were often treated with a considerable amount of hostility. And so this grounding in the narratives of mobility in experience and work were central to what it was that people were doing. What I also saw was that the sort of classic Bourdieusian notion of recognizing difference and distinction as a critical feature of mobility were treated with a certain degree of hostility as well. And so during one of my observations, I saw a young man in the dorm. Every 2 nights a week, there was a formal dinner. And at that formal dinner, the boys had to wear jackets and ties. And I was associated with the dorm. So I spent 2 evenings a week at a dorm and 1 out of every 3 weekends there. And so after one of these formal meals, I saw this young man sort of like taking off his shirt and talking to other people about it. And he went on and on about the quality of his shirt and like its thread count and the way that it was constructed. And I remember when this happened, I wrote back to my then dissertation advisor with like enormous glee, because I said to myself, wow, it's amazing. I just heard this young guy give a kind of recitation on qualities of shirts and how you needed to go to Bond Street in London. It wasn't Bond Street. I forget the name of the street. I'll remember eventually. In London, in order to find the right kind of shirt to wear. This is exactly what I was expecting. And I wrote up, pages and pages of field notes when I got back that evening. Fast forward a couple of days, I was driving around with a group of seniors who lived in that same house. We were heading into Boston for some Chinese food. And I'd sort of learned at the time that getting kids into a car was a good way to get them to sort of chat with you. And one of them said to me, I heard you were talking to Adam and he was going on and on about a shirt the other day. And I was like, yeah, it was fascinating. The kid said to me, it was bullshit is what it was. And the seniors then proceeded to explain to me that they brought the young kids up to their own dormitory rooms because the young kids were really concerned that they had the wrong kinds of shirts. And they showed them that their shirts were from Land's End. They showed them that their shirts were not, they said like, oh, I get my shirts at a, not quite a flea market, but a secondhand store. I knew that itself was also bullshit, that they definitely didn't get them at a secondhand store. But it was interesting to see how this process of distinction making wasn't as important. My argument here isn't that there aren't distinctions. It's that the distinctions grounded in entitlement aren't really the distinctions that elites draw upon today. Now, all of this has consequences for understanding inequality. And what I mean by that is, as I said, we have sort of a new elite and a new form of inequality. The question is how it is that we are both more open and more unequal. And inequalities are clearly enormously durable. And I think there's a few things I want us to take away from this. And I'm going to point to sort of three major conclusions. I know I'm speaking very quickly, but I'm trying to get sort of a talk in 15 minutes. The first is that in other work that I've done, I've noted how elites in a sort of political economy have frequently experienced countercyclical dynamics. And what I mean by that is if you look at the 1960s and you see the patterns of mobility among Americans, one of the things that's really notable is that you have broad-based economic growth for Americans in general and a considerable amount of intergenerational mobility. However, if you look at the ultra elite at the same time, and this is work that's done by economists, Elland and Kopchak, it looks basically at the percentage of Americans in the upper 0.01% of tax returns who are women, which they take as indicators of dynastic wealth, which is actually a pretty good indicator of dynastic wealth. They find that in the 1960s, at this time where most Americans are experiencing broad-based mobility, you have the highest degree of dynastic wealth within the elite. And if we look at wages for elites at that time period, they're pretty stagnant. And so you have this one period where, on average, Americans are quite mobile and their wages are growing and elites are quite stagnant. If we look at over the last, say, 35 years, it's kind of tricky with this, but basically since the early 1980s, we see something very different. So there's not a lot of secular job growth for Americans. Some of that is sort of hidden by a range of things. So there's a little bit, it's probably largely women's wages are going up, men's wages are going slightly down. But basically, American wages are mostly stagnant and intergenerational mobility doesn't really exist much. As many of us will joke, the American dream is alive and well in Denmark, but really not in the US as much anymore. But if you look at the same period of time for elites, one of the things that you see is enormous wage growth among the elites, just profound and tremendous wage growth. And if we were to look to mobility within elites, there are many more elites who are sort of new elites today than there were in the 60s. And this, again, is a marked difference between patterns that are experiencing on average within Americans and within the elite. In this sense, if I were giving a different talk, I'd talk about how there isn't an economy. There are multiple different economies that exist across different parts of the economic distribution. But what it also points to is that when elites today say there's a lot of opportunity and there's a lot of mobility, they are absolutely wrong, except that they, like most of us, suffer from proximity bias, which is to say a bias of proximity of information for people who are close to them, people like them. And within the class or group that they're a part of, they see a lot of new people and they see an enormous amount of wage growth. And so their understanding of economic conditions overall in American society is really, really wrong. But for themselves, it's absolutely accurate, or it's very accurate. And this leads to a kind of cultural understanding of the dynamics of the US that's sort of completely misplaced because they extract from their own experience and make generalizations about the broad population. But in this way, they're not different than you and me. Or maybe they are because we're scholars and we pretend to be rigorous about this. They're not different than most other kinds of people. Let me offer up for this two basic conclusions and then kick the mic over to Ashley. I think one of the things that we can see within the culture of elite is the rise of the individual and the death of collectivism. In other words, groups got together to argue that groups shouldn't matter. They argued for things like access, or the idea that access shouldn't be limited on the basis of some group characteristic. And elite institutions in many ways have embraced this more than any other. Princeton's incoming class is majority minority. These claims have worked their way deep into the psyche of elite, who see themselves less as a class produced by social structures with a shared point of view and a shared kind of history, and instead a collection of the best and brightest. This declassing of elites has allowed for a rise of inequality. Why? Well, not because elites aren't a class, but because they don't think of themselves in these terms. And so social processes that produce inequality are obscured by this cultural framework that they deploy. The inequality that emerges from social structural factors is read as an outcome of individual level difference. And let me just say, this is a kind of classic sociological refrain. The second is to think about the trick of privilege, which is democratic inequality, where the aristocratic marks of class, exclusion, and inheritance have largely been rejected, and a democratic embrace of each individual having their own fair shake is nearly complete. And in this context, difference in outcomes are explained by the capacities of people. The elite have embraced differences among their roles while accepting and even consecrating hierarchy between themselves and others. The difficulty with this move, what I call the kind of trick of privilege, is to make the hierarchy seem natural rather than durable systematic process. And my explanation here draws directly on the work of Pierre Bourdieu and deploys the idea of an embodiment of ease to show how naturalization is socially produced. Embodiment is really a fancy word for a simple idea. That is that we carry our experiences with us, and our time in the world becomes imprinted on our bodies. The importance to embodiment is that once social experiences become embodied, they seem natural. It's just how you carry yourself. We all have to act in some way, and your embodiment is yours. The particular form of embodiment of the new elite is this kind of ease, and the ease is enormously wide-ranging. As they've integrated those that they've previously excluded, the elite have adapted many of the cultural markers they previously shunned. And so the new elite are at ease in a wide range of areas. The implication of all of this is that perhaps cultural hierarchies are not simply imposed by an exclusive practice, but maintained from below. That's the cultural implication from the perspective of elites. If elites are indifferent across some cultural symbols, then the specialness of high cultural markers is not simply maintained by elites through exclusive practices, but also by non-elites who do not engage in practices marked as culturally elite. Think for a moment about, say, a concert. The price of a ticket to the Met Opera is no greater than the price of a ticket to go see Lil Nas X. And students from St. Paul's could probably be observed attending both, whereas students from Concord High School, the local high school, almost only would attend the latter if they could afford the ticket in the first place. And so we might ask where cultural exclusivity comes from those who consume across culture or those who have stronger consumptive tendencies. The question, or this kind of question, and I really am wrapping up here, is the question the new elite ask the world. And the answer is that they're open-minded and others are closed-minded. The distinction between elites and the rest of us appears to be a choice. It's a cosmopolitanism that explains elite status to elites, and closed-mindedness that explains those who choose not to participate in this new and open world. What matters is individual attributes and capacities and not durable inequalities. And from this point of view, those who are not successful are not necessarily disadvantaged. They are simply those who have failed to seize the opportunities afforded by our new open society. This embodied ease then is a physical manifestation of such openness, and it makes differences seem natural. Inequality becomes the product of who you are, not where you're from. Society then recesses in the minds of elites as producing social problems. It's to be as benign as possible, to sit in the background as we play out our lives on a relatively even field. I'll note that for these arguments that I make, I think some of the recent developments with Black Lives Matter and et cetera kind of push them. And this is something Ashley and I have sort of written about in another context. What I want to end with then is to think about this delusion or fable that elites tell themselves and others in order to obscure their continual domination and inheritance. But I think that this is the cultural dynamic that we need to understand if we're to make sense of the persistent increasing inequalities in our world. I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Khan. That was an extraordinary ride. You packed so much in that in just 20 minutes. I'm sure many of you who are listening have questions. So there is that little Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please just start typing in questions whenever you like, and sign your name if you will, so that I can pass the questions on to the panelists when we're finished. If you're one of the many people who are seeing us later on YouTube, come on over to our website and you can continue the conversation that way. Our next speaker is Ashley Mears, an associate professor of sociology at Boston University. Professor Mears, welcome to Brown University. Professor Mears' work focuses on how societies value people and things. As she puts it, the cultured and gendered foundations of markets, of consumptions, of elites. She has not just an appointment in sociology, but in women's gender and sexual studies. Her first book was called Pricing Beauty, the Making of a Fashion Model. She has received grants from organizations as disparate as the National Science Foundation and the Whiting Foundation. And here's my favorite line from your bio, Professor Mears. Featured in outlets like the New York Times, the BBC, The Economist, NPR, and Chinese Cosmo. Professor Mears, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm glad that you caught that. Not that many people comment on it, but there's definitely like a wink and a nod there. So thank you for having me. Thanks for organizing this terrific panel. It's great to share the stage with everybody. Thanks, Shamus, for that really great talk. And I'm really glad, Shamus, that you brought it to the beginning of your kind of origin story as a sociologist following these topics, because I'm going to follow lockstep, because my work focuses on gender and the elites, which is the part that I'll talk about today. And specifically, I'll talk about this book that I wrote in 2020, called Very Important People, which specifically looks at the value of women's bodies in elite social spaces. And I was thinking that the best way to introduce you to this book is to explain my first confrontations with the ideas within it. So 2 days after I graduated college, I boarded a plane to Hong Kong to fulfill a modeling contract. Throughout my college years, I went to the University of Georgia. I was in the small modeling market of Atlanta. It's a commercial catalog market. It offered occasional gigs, but they also placed local models with agencies around the world in exchange for a commission. So I joined this global trade of young women sent to established and emerging fashion markets. It took me to Milan, Tokyo, Osaka, and there I was in Hong Kong, because I didn't have such a firm plan of what I would be doing after graduation. Now, in Hong Kong, I ended up spending 6 months there, and I would learn a lot about the value of beauty in Asian fashion markets, as well as about the importance of beauty in an adjacent space, elite nightlife. Now, when I say it's an adjacent space, I actually mean that literally, because the man that owned the modeling agency that I was working with in central Hong Kong also owned an exclusive nightclub just downstairs in the basement of this gleaming office tower. He put it to me like this. He said, quote, "The two businesses support each other," which definitely became readily apparent. There was a procession of international models, mostly young white women between, say, 16 and 25 years old, that were circulating through the market. They would go upstairs in the office tower to meet with their agents about modeling jobs. And then later in the day, they would head downstairs into the basement club for drinks and dancing late into the night. Models were always welcome to come in and drink for free in nightclubs, actually in all of the modeling markets that I've toured, always compliments of the house. So the women had come to the agency for work, but it was actually their leisure in the club that really yielded the profits, because rich and aspiring businessmen who lived and worked in and around Hong Kong came to socialize with each other in the company of beautiful women. Now, the city's elite club owners were friends with each other and with their male clientele. Many of them had grown up together. They came from some of the wealthiest families in Hong Kong. They'd gone to the same boarding schools and some of the same Ivy League universities abroad. Models, most of whom had a high school education, if that, circulated among this network. They're kind of the flip side of this revolving door that often describes men in positions of power. So Dragon Eye is one such famous club. If you've been through Hong Kong, you've probably heard it. It's in this party neighborhood called Lan Kwai Fong. And on Monday nights, it held a multi-course dinner for models that the bankers in the city jokingly referred to as, quote, Hungry Monday. That's a reference to models' general economic insecurity, such that they reliably turned out in high numbers for a free meal, and they would stay in the club afterwards where the bankers could socialize with them. So I was 21 years old at the time, and I was both seduced and repulsed by this arrangement. I loved to go out. I didn't really want to pay for it myself. I couldn't really afford it either. But I sensed that it wasn't an even trade, that there's an imbalance of power that structures this exchange of capital between beauty and money. And that's the core of my argument in the book, Very Important People. So Very Important People is a book about the global VIP party circuit and the transactions that align men with money and women with beauty. It's based on an ethnography in which I followed a party circuit and the people that organized the parties between New York, the Hamptons, Miami, and a kind of short stint in the French Riviera. But I think it captures this global phenomenon that I had observed at the seat of the table back at Hungry Monday in Hong Kong. So VIP is also an ethnography of conspicuous consumption. It's a site for wealthy people to show off their wealth through positional goods, defined as conspicuous consumption, and it centers around bottled service. So in bottle service, there's high-priced bottles of alcohol that are brought to a table, and they're lit up with fireworks and with a procession. It's kind of part of a big show. The prices for some of these bottles go up 1,000% markup. Some of them are gold-plated. They, come out with a lot of fanfare and celebrations, and lots of picture taking and clapping. So the prices kind of parallel with the rise in luxury spending that has kept pace with this kind of huge soaring pools of disposable income among the economic elite globally. So just to say a caveat that this is just one slice of the economic elite that I've had a chance to observe, people that are partying in VIP nightclubs. It's very different from, say, elites in philanthropy circles. Sometimes there's overlap, but this space is for sure less legitimized socially, but it's also very highly visible. I was working on a project on the rich kids of Instagram and documenting these incredibly creative ways and ostentatious ways that young people with lots of money show themselves on social media, drinking champagne, wasting champagne, pouring it in their dogs' bowls, pouring it in their cereal. You get the idea, yeah. So this is a kind of very highly visible, ritualized form of ostentation that centers in these kinds of elite or VIP nightclubs. Now, within this global leisure class, or as one person who circulates within it described to me as a tribe, women with a certain kind of beauty, which is narrowly defined by the fashion industry, are mobilized to attract elite men. And in the company of beautiful women, men are able to forge business and social ties with one another and generate profits, though women, I argue, are largely cut out of those kinds of networks. So my way in to study this tribe was with a group of men that are known as promoters. They work for nightclubs. They do the work of piecing together people at the tables in the clubs. A large part of their job is spent in trying to find the right kinds of women, who are referred to as girls, because they're assumed to be of younger age. Most of them are. And I followed them for about 18 months. And I interviewed a set of promoters and also women and also clients, people that are spending in the clubs. The promoters are, by and large, young men between late 20s, kind of early 30s, not much older than that. They are disproportionately Black and brown men. The women, or rather girls, I'll use that language now very reflexively because they're entering into the research site with me. So the girls are disproportionately white. So there's a kind of clear racialized dynamic here. The promoters are earning between $200 and $1,000 a night, which is a great cash income for men who are themselves not particularly educated and not used to making that much money. The women, for the most part, or actually the women entirely, are not paid. So the promoters are making a lot of money and the girls are not making anything, but they get to go out and they're in these kind of seductive, beautiful spaces. So in classical anthropological terms, I define this as a system of traffic. It's a traffic in women. A traffic in women defined by anthropologists is one in which there's a circulation of women that are adding value or lending value to men, but men control that flow and that circulation. And so women don't have the capacity to benefit from the value that they themselves are producing, and men are kind of controlling this. And this is created in earlier studies of kinship and the circulation of young men, of young women among tribal systems that are controlled by men. When people hear trafficking, of course, they often think about the kind of, worst, most coercive uses of people's bodies against their will, like sex trafficking. But I think that the concept is actually really useful just to think about gender and power dynamics. And it's also useful, has been useful for me to think about women's exclusion among the elite. So to give you an example of kind of how flexible this concept of trafficking can be, I was looking at an article that came out in a Swedish publication, a report from Jeffrey Epstein. Actually, a colleague sent it to both Shamus and myself. It documents how Jeffrey Epstein, among many of his philanthropic ventures, was also giving money to the Stockholm School of Economics for scholarships for women. And then there's a woman who's helping to set up the scholarship named Barbara, where is her name? Oh yeah, Barbara Enbaum. She's a founder of this scholarship. She cultivates ties with Jeffrey Epstein, and then he's donating money. And then she is bringing young Swedish women to his New York mansion in Manhattan for parties. And, ostensibly it's about cultivating a Swedish business network for women, but coming through Jeffrey Epstein's house. And later, as allegations, and then later, the realities of what Jeffrey Epstein was really up to comes apparent. Barbara makes this really interesting observation about why has Jeffrey Epstein been charged with trafficking. She says, quote, "Trafficking is something terrible. They'll take a 10-year-old girl, put her in a truck into a brothel and beat her. That's trafficking. I don't know if sitting on a plane and drinking champagne with Prince Andrew is trafficking. Maybe another kind of trafficking," she says. Yes, so the kind of connotation that trafficking is somehow coercive in the kind of worst sort of physical and mental exploitation of somebody is one kind of extreme end of it, whereas something that's pleasurable or something that's enjoyable and something that can actually be taken part in consensually is a different kind of trafficking, but one that I think is also extremely powerful to think about these kinds of circuits in which women are adding value, but are not themselves able to capitalize on. So for instance, among the men that I interviewed, the promoters who were working these circuits and kind of doing the work of bringing young women into these clubs in Saint-Tropez and the Hamptons and so on, they would explain that women are a very important way to kind of signal their importance. And even the clients who were there in the clubs buying these bottles of champagne would note that women were a way for them to signal their importance to other men at the tables. One even said, quote, "Women are important as decoration. You always need them, especially in the beginning," right? Because they are a kind of form of decor, which lends status and lends honor. There's other forms of decoration that men are using in these spaces, status signifiers like the branded clothing, champagne bottles, right? Even arrival into very exclusive, kind of hard to get into parties in Cannes or Fashion Week parties. So the system of traffic kind of attracts men through the presentation and very kind of conspicuous display of girls. And I should also note, when I was doing this field work, I myself was called a girl, even though I was at the age already of 32. So I would never, consider myself with that language, with that term at that age. But it's a social category. It denotes a social position of a young woman who's assumed to be kind of outside of marriage, without obligations of work, and is assumed to be kind of frivolous. And that was indeed the positionality that I took in order to get a seat at the table. So we have these two ends then of trafficking. There's these kind of champagne parties, and then there's this world of Jeffrey Epstein and sex trafficking. And I would say that in between, there's a rich variety of social systems that obfuscate the trade to make it look less disreputable than it is. There's a kind of systems in place, structural systems, and also interpersonal relations that are in place to kind of make this circulation of women feel more appropriate and look more appropriate, especially to outsiders, than kind of would. So on the one hand, there's philanthropy. So by giving money to a legitimate cause, one is then entitled to, the company of young women at dinner parties. And then there's also champagne parties, in which one who has lots of money is able to purchase the company of young women, but without explicitly purchasing it, rather purchasing bottles of alcohol that come with beautiful young women. So at the core in the VIP circuit, the people that are piecing together that trade, these promoters, are bringing women in through what sociologist Viviana Zalazar would call relational work, things like gifts and building up intimacies. As I mentioned, these dinners are comped, the champagne flows freely. The promoters work very hard to establish meaningful social connections and social ties and cultivate friendships with the women that they bring out. They also stand to gain from the presence of the girls. One of the promoters explained to me that it's quite easy to get ahead in the VIP world. All you have to do is walk around with good girls, meaning very beautiful girls, and you'll attract notice. And I found it kind of so pervasively, even among the clubs. The club industry itself is a multi-billion-dollar industry that's owned and operated almost entirely by men. So I often say that it's an elite world that's run by men and for men, but on girls. It was so striking, in fact, the ways in which the presence of and ties to beautiful women could lend value, that I began to see women's beauty as a kind of capital, but one that is worth more in men's hands than in the women themselves. So I call this girl capital, meaning girls as a form of capital that this circuit is able to create value from. Okay, so you may be asking at this point, well, where are the women, right? If the 32-year-old sociologist at the table is also a girl. Women who were seen as being in their 30s were understood to be desperate. They were understood to be aging out. They were kind of generally talked about as failures in their life if they don't have something more serious going on. So there was a kind of very clear penalty for older women in these spaces, where seeing older men wasn't the norm, but it definitely wouldn't be met with as much social sanction as having having an older woman. You may also be asking at this point, well, what's in it for the girls? And I think that this is actually a really central question to think about, what exclusivity does for propelling desire to join these kinds of spaces. For many of the girls who are in this space, it comes down to a free meal. One of the surprising things that I found in my first book, which was a study of the fashion modeling market, is that fashion models, for the most part, don't make very much money. It's a very clear winner-take-all hierarchy. You've got a handful of people at the very top that make a great living, but most people are not. And most people are looking for a free meal and could use the kind of comped night out. Other girls believe in the relationships that promoters are cultivating with them. They believe in these friendships. And they also, I think really importantly, want this access that they otherwise wouldn't afford in this exclusive world, especially for young models that are traveling to cities like New York or Hong Kong. Clearly, they're surrounded by all of the signs of wealth and power around them, the kind of gleaming office towers and the proximity to elite, and yet there's no way to access it themselves because they lack those material resources, but they are welcome as this form of girl capital. So I think that this matters very much for a kind of general observation that Randall Collins, a social theorist, had observed. He said, men are to class as women are to status. And you could definitely see this here, in which women's beauty is a part of this social alchemy that transforms men's money into visible signs of status, such that they can recognize each other in the room and across this entire circuit. And thinking about a kind of broader implication for gender dynamics among the elite and trying to unpack mechanisms of masculine domination among the elite, it's an instance of, or it's an opportunity to think about the patriarchal bargain, which is something that anthropologists had described of how women take subservient positions in exchange for the security of men's power. Susan Ostrander, in her interview study of wealthy women who were partnered with men in the elite in a book back in 1994 called Women of the Upper Class, she noted that women marry, she's noted that women who are marrying men are often involved in the kind of social realm of generating prestige, both taking care of the children, getting them into the right schools, but also heavily involved in philanthropy, the kind of forward face or public face or opportunity for men to kind of show status with their money. So women, when they marry into upper classes, they likely have careers and credentials of their own, as we know from the logic of assortative mating, but they often opt out of work. They put their careers on hold to manage households and children. And that's part of this classed patriarchal bargain, that women consent to a lesser position to be close to men to power, and to be in a higher position vis-a-vis other women and other men. So this is one window, I think, that's an important contribution to theorizing masculine domination among the elite. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mears, for taking us somewhere. I will speak for the entire audience that I'm sure none of us have gone before. Fascinating story. Let me now introduce Professor Finn. Professor Finn is a lecturer at the University of Michigan. She's a lecturer in literature, science, and the arts. She started out as an English PhD student, but soon discovered that she had more of an affinity for the study of American culture. Her work is on the intersection of food and culture. She analyzes mass media texts in order to understand the US food movement, and with a broad historical sweep from the 1880s to the present. Her book, I should have done this for the others too. Oh, it's backwards. You'll have to go to the poster. Her book, published with Rutgers University Press, Discriminating Taste, How Class Anxiety Created the American Food Revolution. And we move with Professor Finn from a place we've never been to a place where we've all been, which is thinking about food. And I think you'll find the kinds of things she says maybe just a little bit disconcerting. I certainly did. But Professor Finn, welcome to Brown. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, and thanks for the invitation. Thanks to the Watson Institute. I actually have slides, so I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. Okay, hopefully everybody can see those. So yeah, I think we're turning a little bit from talking about some pretty elite and exclusive spaces to how that kind of stuff affects the middle classes and maybe a broader swath. So I'm going to share just some of the main argument, especially the historical part of my 2017 book, Discriminating Taste, that you just saw. Let's see, I need to be able to advance my slides. There we go. So this began life as an American Studies dissertation that I initially thought was going to be about wine. So this was in the mid-2000s when wine had just surpassed beer as America's alcoholic beverage of choice, according to Gallup polling. The wine and cheese reception had pretty much replaced the cocktail hour, especially for the upper classes. And even people like my Midwestern elementary school librarian mom were getting into wine. So I opened the book with this story about my mom basically being wine shamed by her work frenemy. She came in and said that she'd had a little bit too much white Zinfandel the night before. And the woman came back with, "Oh no, that's the hot dog of wines," which is just sort of an amazing utterance, right? Because at some points in American history, hot dog was a kind of a compliment. You know, you'd say hot dog to indicate excitement about something, or if it were pejorative, the implication would be of somebody who's kind of a show-off. You still hear this in sports a little bit, right? He's a hot dog, means that he thinks he's hot shit, not that he thinks he's dog food. But the hot dog of wines was clearly meant to insult my mom's taste. So I kind of set out to figure out essentially how we got there, how we got to a point where it could make sense for one elementary school Midwestern, middle-class librarian to wine shame another one by comparing their taste in wine to a hot dog. And when I started to look into it, it quickly became clear that whatever was going on with wine probably had to be related to this broader shift in American attitudes toward food that a number of other writers and scholars had described as a revolution. Sometimes it was the American food revolution, sometimes it was a culinary revolution, sometimes an organic revolution, but the word revolution was invoked time and again, even though it was unclear what exactly people were talking about or if they were even talking about the same thing. But in the news media, especially, there was just this sense that, a revolutionary change had undergone. Like everybody's shopping at farmers markets and drinking craft beer and pour over coffee and eating bulgogi tacos from food trucks that they're following on Twitter. Like we're obviously in this food obsessed age, and it wasn't always like that. But then a lot of the examples that people would give of this revolution were either not quite compatible or outright contradictory. So was this really about sustainability, about buying local, if that's better, organic, if that's better, maybe eating less meat, if that's better? Or was it about sophistication, about America finally developing an appreciation for things like fine wine and cheese, most of which had to be imported? Or was this about health, about the then fever pitch panic about obesity and the idea that we should probably eat a whole lot less cheese? Or was the problem bread and pasta and potatoes? The experts didn't always agree on what kind of food was better, but this idea and convictions about betterness in food were on everyone's lips. So the first thing that I did was identify 4 themes in the broader shift that was being called the food revolution. There was the idea that Americans had gotten way more interested in gourmet food, including wine, so I called that sophistication. There was the staggering market for weight loss diets and the idealization of thinness as a proxy for health. There was the rise of natural foods, including organic and also ethical issues like animal welfare and fair trade, all the things that retailers like Whole Foods specialize in, which I ultimately called purity. That's a callback to the pure food movement that I'll talk about a little bit in a minute. And then there was also the growing availability and popularity of diverse international and regional cuisines, all the things we call ethnic food, which spoke to an ideal of cosmopolitanism and that idea of being an adventurous eater and seeking out the most authentic other kinds of racial and ethnic cuisines. Now, there were definitely overlaps. So, for example, the chef, writer, activist Alice Waters is often credited with bringing a French culinary ethos, which has been seen as sophisticated in the US since the 18th century, to the Bay Area with the founding of Chez Panisse. She was also active in, and she's been active in the slow food movement that is more associated with purity. She's been an advocate for eating locally grown food. She also started this edible schoolyard project. But that's been defended largely on the premise that if you get kids to eat more vegetables, you can fight childhood obesity. So she definitely touches on thinness too. And if you consider French cosmopolitanism, and I think it can kind of go back and forth in how other it actually seems, she might hit all 4. But there are certainly other trends in this revolution, like the low carb diet and its cheerleaders like Gary Taubes, that were focused pretty much exclusively on thinness. They weren't at all concerned about the environmental impacts of food or how authentic their endless piles of steak and bacon might be to any culinary tradition. And meanwhile, there were people like the users of Chowhound leader Chow that were really all about trying to find the most authentic, obscure, mom and pop, immigrant run hole in the wall with the best pho or bulgogi or menudo. And it would have been heresy to consider the nutritional implications of those meals. In terms of chronology, all the accounts I was finding basically agreed that there were some precursors of this revolution in the 60s and 70s. So Julia Child goes on the air in 1963. Weight Watchers is founded in the same year. Chez Panisse opens in 1971, and that's also the same year that Francis Mourlapé publishes Diet for a Small Planet, and the counterculture starts taking up organic gardening. Frugal Gourmet goes on the air in 1973, and it was largely a celebration of diverse international cuisines. That's what made them frugal. But most of these things were kind of on the fringes. They were seen as a little bit weird. Not a whole lot of people were really cooking along with Julia Child. She was seen as kind of a nutty personality in some ways. By 1980, these things really go mainstream. So 1980 is the year the first Whole Foods market opens in Austin. Diet Coke comes on the market in 1982. Williams-Sonoma has the public stock offering that preceded its transformation from just a kind of Bay Area thing to a national chain of gourmet cookware in 1983. And the national craze for sushi is usually traced to the Shogun television miniseries that aired in September of 1980. So the puzzle that I set out to solve was, why did all of these relatively independent ideals about how we should eat get popular in the American mainstream at this particular historical moment? What was going on that made people want to eat better in these sometimes contradictory ways? And the first thing I did was try to look at the longer history of these ideals. So the implication of the revolution language, of course, was that these things were new. There was some like 1960s vanguards, but once people discovered them, they were destined to go mainstream because they were just so much better, so self-evidently better than the industrial, mass-produced, fattening, homogenous, bland food that everyone was eating in the 1940s and 1950s. So this is kind of a typical account that comes from Foodies by Johnston and Bauman from 2010 that started in 1940 with the founding of Gourmet magazine, and says it kind of, it snowballs after the 60s. But when I looked further back, I discovered that all of the trends that identified in the contemporary food revolution had parallels at the turn of the 20th century. So if you look at the history of French food in America, there were some wealthy and prominent Americans who'd been enamored of French food going back to the revolution proper, right? Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin were pretty famously big fans, but it really didn't get popular with the broader American public until the 1880s. And it wasn't that people didn't know French food existed before that. Instead, what you see in cookbooks written in the 1860s and earlier is either an absence of French words or a sort of apologetic disclaimer. So here's an example from The American Women's Home, which was written by Catherine Beecher and Harriet Beecher Stowe, published in 1869. And they're talking about how hard it is to find meat that's been butchered in the French style. And they anticipate their reader's response as, oh, we can't give time in America here to go into niceties of French wimwams. And then you have other cookbooks of the time saying things like you should be able to include some French cookery without being accused of foreign foppery. And what words like wimwams and foppery tell us is that French food was being rejected or in danger of being rejected because it was seen as too fancy and as too pretentious, and those were not seen as good things. By the 1880s, it's a different world. Cookbooks aimed at the middle classes were full of French, and the menus that they recommended for dinner parties, even for young couples of moderate means, were suddenly these multi-course affairs. Magazines like Good Housekeeping were publishing articles and letters about what they called the servant crisis, because throwing elaborate dinner parties like this required hiring extra help, and it was hard to find enough people that had the skills and the training to pull off a menu like this. And you can see the French influence in things like crab bisque, turbot à la crème, potato croquette, Parisian vol au vent, iced orange granite, fried frog legs, cauliflower au gratin. So people went from being apologetic about including French things to assuming that French things were desirable and expected even for formal entertaining. The first wave of weight loss dieting and the idea that thinness was both attractive and healthy also gets started in the late 1880s and 1890s. Before that, the ideal body was typically described as voluptuous. The highest paid entertainer in the country in the 1880s was Lillian Russell, who was called America's Beauty at 5'6" and about 200 pounds. But in the 1890s, suddenly people were calling her a white elephant. She embarked on a very public campaign of exercise and dieting that she wrote about in some Chicago newspaper. She wrote a column about dieting. Meanwhile, actresses like Sarah Bernhardt, who on her first visit to America in 1880 was called too skinny to be an actress, suddenly became beautiful overnight. older diets that had previously been recommended for things like indigestion or nervous exhaustion, including diets that were supposed to actually help people gain weight when that was seen as necessary for their health, were now rebranded as ways to get slim, as slimming techniques. A bunch of new diets also appeared, including the first rise of calorie counting, still familiar to many today. And there was also something called Fletcherism, which you were supposed to chew every bite that you took 100 times, basically making eating too time-consuming and annoying to do very much of it. And we don't really know how many people engaged in Fletcherism or any of these other techniques. Sorry, too far. But they were called a national craze, a national pastime. So there was really a sense of these things being a kind of widespread practice. There was also a grassroots movement, much like the sustainable food movement today, that sought to both reform the industrial food system and educate consumers so that they could make healthier choices. We now call it the pure food movement. At the time, it had a number of different kinds of names. One part of this, just down the road from me in Battle Creek, Michigan, Ella Kellogg founded an institute that attempted to teach women how to avoid diseased and unnatural foods like refined sugar, white flour, spicy and sour condiments. It's actually pretty familiar from some of the health claims today, except for that spices and sour thing. So they really thought that the pickles and spices that immigrants were using were probably too stimulating and might excite sexual passions, among other dangerous things. In 1884 was kind of when you started to see women. There was a group in Manhattan that organized to try and get the local slaughterhouse to clean up its act. And so interesting too that these things were united from the beginning too, this idea that we're going to get slaughterhouses to clean up their act, and also we're going to stop eating white flour and white sugar. Today, pure food movement is often associated with two men, Upton Sinclair and Teddy Roosevelt, for the novel The Jungle and the Pure Food and Drug Act. But much like dieting and the slimming diets, the dinner parties, this was really about upper middle class women who were really driving these trends. So like the women even, you know, at about the time The Jungle is coming out, this is still the National Housewives Alliance who is doing a lot of the campaigning for these kinds of things. And lastly, it's that same demographic that was suddenly fascinated with foreign and international foods in the 1880s as well, which marked a real departure from the staunch culinary nationalism of the Civil War era and its immediate aftermath. So the Civil War era and its aftermath is what give us the Thanksgiving meal as a deliberate attempt to unite our divided country around this kind of shared harvest meal tradition. But in the 1880s, you get a real turn towards international foods. And my favorite, there's a lot of this in the cookbooks and stuff aimed at the upper middle class and good housekeeping, but my favorite example comes from the industrial food system. So this is the list of Campbell's soup offerings from 1911. These were all in production as early as 1905. So you see mulligatawny, consommé, julienne, chicken gumbo, pepper pot, printanier, that's a French name for vegetable soup, and vermicelli tomato. So even things like, you know, they're trying to market their vegetable soup as a fancy French soup, even for, this is for the masses, this is Campbell's. Most of those soups were either renamed or dropped entirely in the 1930s, which is when all of these trends fall out of popularity. So instead of French preparations and fancy flourishes, cookbooks start emphasizing frugality, plainness, familiarity, and comfort. The idealization of thinness and the flapper gives way to a renewed interest in voluptuous bodies and the hourglass figure that many people remember from mid-century film stars. And you also get the Cornell Nutrition Lab was putting on these lectures for the public on nutrition, and they start to say things in the 1930s about how the interest in weight loss has finally receded a bit. Grassroots activism to reform the food system disappears almost entirely. The Battle Creek Sanitarium went into receivership in 1933 because patronage was down over 75%. Japanese teas and international dinners that so captivated people in the 1880s and 1890s fall out of fashion. So the whole food culture shifts. Now, I should say, I'm not a historian. I compiled this history from reading other historians' accounts of what's going on in the 19th and 20th centuries in fashion and restaurant history and consumer culture and nutrition and medicine and agriculture. And what was interesting to me is that they all agreed on the basic chronology. So they all agreed that these things were first getting popular in the 1880s, that they were a real departure from what came before, and then that they declined or disappeared entirely after the 1930s, after the Great Depression. But they all had a different theory about why. There were a dozen different theories about what was going on with this rise and fall. So the one theory that ended up making sense to me and fitting with kind of all of the trends was status anxiety. And that came to primarily from Richard Hofstadter. He's the one we credit with that. So he accounted for the rise of progressive era activism by saying that these middle class, the emerging middle classes and professionals, doctors, lawyers, professors, small business owners, who were used to being among the cultural and political leaders of their communities were eclipsed by the rise of the new Gilded Age super elite. And so these moral crusades against alcohol and impure food and immorality of big business were a way for them to try to reassert their cultural authority. So at root, the growing income and wealth disparities of the Gilded Age made people more conscious and more anxious about their relative status. And this was probably exacerbated by the growth of national mass culture forms like magazines and radio that exposed people across the country to the lifestyles of the rich and famous, even if those people were in sort of distant cities where the wealth was concentrated. So what unites all four themes in the food revolution, both in the Gilded Age and today, is that they're associated with high status. French dinner parties and service à la Russe were seen as imperative for entertaining in polite society. Slimming diets and thin bodies were associated with the elite and especially pursued by status-conscious women. The pure food movement was almost entirely spearheaded by college-educated professional women and the wives of prominent men. And the same thing is true for cosmopolitan dining. And then the decline of all these trends coincides with the Great Depression, when the runaway incomes at the very top plummet, and then they remained fringe throughout the 4 decades now sometimes referred to as the Great Compression, when income inequality was historically low. They reemerge in the 1980s, along with the return to rates of income inequality last seen in the Gilded Age. So here's a chart many of you are probably familiar with from Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, showing the national share of share of national income held by the top 10%. So we see how it just falls off the cliff during and after the 1930s, and then remains low for a long time until the return to high rates of inequality in the 1980s. So just to read one part, I'll say, what I ultimately argue, kind of the heart of the book, is during periods of greater income inequality, the middle class relies more on symbolic distinctions of taste to distance themselves from the lower classes. When the middle class as a whole is doing materially well and the upper middle class isn't claiming as much of the nation's wealth, the cultural politics of taste shift. Then the middle class solidifies its identity by embracing the familiar and pedestrian and reacts more punitively against conspicuous displays of wealth or anything that smacks of class climbing. And I should emphasize that I don't think this is a deliberate process. I don't think people are going, oh, hey, my status feels really precarious. I know I'm going to go on a diet and start drinking wine. So I think people are pretty sensitive to how their consumption signals status, but I think their investment in the idea that the kinds of food that they like and think are better really are better is real. So much of my book and the part where I do the kind of media study stuff is focused on the mediating factor between class anxiety and consumption, which is, I think, ideology. So status anxieties, which inevitably are going to change in response to changes in class formation, make people more or less likely to invest in the prevailing ideologies regarding what kinds of foods we've all decided at that moment might be better or worse. The idea that wine is sophisticated and that sophistication in food is a desirable thing and not something to avoid is more attractive to people in ages where Gilded Age tight inequality gaps create incentives for the middle class to engage in a sort of symbolic striving through food. Okay, so I can stop my screen share there.
Super, thank you. What a marvelous tour de force of a presentation, of 3 presentations. And we've got a couple of questions. I think we've got time for a bunch, but let me ask all 3 of you the question that really gets raised by where you ended, Professor Finn, and that's the sort of Piketty chart of how eras of compression look so different from eras of great inequality, and to some extent, all of your presentations show us different aspects of the contemporary Gilded Age. I wonder if you'd each imagine for a second to what extent what you've discussed is so enduring that it would survive were many of us's wish to be granted and a new era of compression start and the Gilded Age come to an end. That is, to what extent have the changes you've described become so deep that they would live beyond the new Gilded Age were, say, great tax reforms to go into place? And to what extent are they really bounded and require the fuel of great distinctions between wealth? You've each talked in really quite sophisticated ways about this, but perhaps you each want to just say a word about it. Professor Khan, maybe we could start with you and go right across the board.
Sure. I mean, the moment of time of the Great Compression, in this sort of post World War II moment, it's sort of there's a lot for us to also note about that moment. So, Piketty basically focuses on economic inequality over that time period, and in the time that we have the Great Divergence, so basically 1972 through today, there are a lot of other things that happen that are not the Great Divergence. So if we look at women's wages over that time period, you see a massive rise in women's wages. There's still a significant wage gap. If you look at the experiences for racial and ethnic minorities, huge increase in Black wages over that time period when you have also this Great Divergence. And so I think this kind of points a little bit to Ashley's analysis as well, where I think one of the challenges for elite research, I think this doesn't apply to Margot's analysis as much, is that it really focuses on a unidimensional aspect of elites, which is economic inequality, and has not integrated fundamental insights about intersectionality within the broader social sciences or an attention to the standing of women. Now, I am not so naive as to say Black Americans are equal to everyone else today and women experience conditions of equality. But I do think that across that time period, you see this really dramatic thing that's happening, that's important for us to recognize and integrate into our explanations as part of what's happening as well.
Great, thank you. Professor Mears?
Yeah. Thank you so much. Actually, the question about so I'll center it around my ideas on gender inequality among the elite, and would that look different if economic elite wasn't so vast globally that we see today? And actually, it's a good connection, or it's a different way of asking the question that Daniel Jordan Smith asks in the Q&A as well, which is how general is the phenomenon that I'm seeing? Is it specific to the elites? If there wasn't this sharp economic inequality, would we still see this phenomenon? And so I love this question in the comment, because I see this phenomenon everywhere. I see it, the exchange of women's bodies and the circulation of women lending value to economic projects fundamentally controlled disproportionately by men. I see that on my college campus, which is an interesting college, because my college is Boston University, which is right next to Harvard and also MIT. And so you can definitely see this hierarchy of parties of who's going to get into the Harvard party, who's going to get into the final club at the Harvard party, right? Or versus who has to go to some sweaty frat basement at BU campus. So the other people have also noted this in Greek college campus life, that fraternity parties are the ones that the young women want to get into, but they're controlled by men who are looking to get certain kinds of women in. And if they have the right parties, then the prestige of the fraternity rises. And so again, women are kind of circulating through these spaces, adding value to a system that is fundamentally controlled by men. I see it in I see this kind of dynamic all over the place. Once I started thinking in these terms of girl capital, it's I can't really shake it. But I think that something specific about the elite is that these spaces that I studied, that the form is actually really, really unique. The specificity of this extremely narrow definition of the body, which we know, from Margot's work and lots of work about the social constructedness of ideal looks and bodies. It's very contingent, but here it's a certain kind of look that's sanctified by the fashion modeling industry, precisely because it's really hard to be a fashion model to conform to that kind of body. And so that rarity lends value. So yeah, I think a lot of goal in sociology is to kind of make things that seem strange more familiar. And so I think that the dynamic that I've captured here is pretty generalizable. The form is unique. And so if there were, another compression, no, I don't see this dynamic changing, but the specificities definitely would.
Yeah, great. People watching later will not be able to see the question, so just let me read it.
Oh, yeah.
Though you've answered the question, but just so people know, Daniel Jordan Smith from the anthropology department here at Brown. Despite what Jim said about your talk and book taking us somewhere we've never been before, it seems to me what you describe occurs in less splashy ways in the everyday performance and reproduction of class and status in the United States and in many societies. Could you comment on the degree to which these dynamics play out more generally, which you've just done both the generalizable and the specificity? So thank you, Professor Smith, for that excellent question. That has been folded in. And finally, Professor Finn, are we going back to canned soup?
First, can you make this happen just so I can find out? Like, I mean, my theory would be—
That would be a great experimental. Yes, I take your point. What a great experimental, which will get us to our next question. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, sure. But I mean, I guess the one thing I think that what you see in the mid-century with, people just weren't that interested in fancy foods more broadly. There was a sense of, it wasn't like, people were choosing Budweiser, and they were choosing the plain Manhattan, and they were choosing the steak and the roasted chicken, and they didn't want ethnic foods. There's this great article from like the late 60s in Manhattan. You get this woman talking about how, like, if she feeds her husband anything, that's not a steak or chicken, he looks at her like she's trying to kill him. And that was kind of standard. That was an unremarkable utterance for a middle-class woman in Manhattan in the 60s. By the 80s, I think that would just look real different. But I think some of that is about not just like what is being idealized broadly, but whether or not people think that cultural capital is desirable, and then whether or not they think they can have access to it. And maybe this gets at some of what Professor Khan has said about that. There is diversity within this, right? So whether or not you're going to pursue the cultural capital that might be associated with kale depends on whether or not the context you're in rewards that, right? Like, are people going to think that you are making a virtuous choice when you eat kale, or are people think you're doing something real weird that isn't really yours to have? So I do think that if the incentives for cultural capital striving came down, and then also people were no longer seeing that as necessarily as desirable of a thing, yeah, I think people would be prouder of their continuing affection for Kraft mac and cheese.
Great. We've got a question from Professor Richard Snyder, my colleague in political science. And this one goes to Professors Khan and Mears. Ethnography obviously plays a central role in your research on elites and inequality. What do you see as the special strengths and also the weaknesses of ethnographies of inequity? What complementarities do you see with other methods of social science research, especially experimental and quantitative modes of knowing? Rich teaches a course on this, so anything you say will go right into a syllabus, so choose your words carefully. Thanks, Rich, for the question. Do either one of you want to take that first? I'm sure you've heard this question before, and it should be noted that I said to Professor Mears beforehand, skip the methodological appendix for this audience, and here we go, straight to that. Professor Mears, you want to take this one first, and then on to
yeah, sure. So, within sociology, we have such great cultural studies based on qualitative data and ethnographies that really are able to capture the meanings and the practices of belonging to certain class cultures. Like, we have an understanding of what it takes to be a working class lad, right? Or like what it takes to be a middle class parent from Annette Leroux and Paul Willis. But, we're pretty slow on understanding what's the constitution of meaning and practices among elites, because it's been harder to access. And so, first it's just studying up, being able to capture the kind of texture and worldviews that kind of form the backbone of a lot of cultural sociology of understanding class cultures. But there's definitely a drawback in my own work. I see this. It's quite limited to make claims to larger institutional fields of power. In the sense that the ethnographer is always limited, right? Like I couldn't go on every yacht and follow every club and see like what the kind of interactions happening there in the space that people would talk about in interviews as being meaningful for their business relationships and social belonging among the elite, but it couldn't verify it and see how this concatenates up to larger institutions. I think that that's a limit of ethnography, can be somewhat mollified with interviews. But it complements really well with, I think, network analysis of, studies of interlocks, the kind of nuances. If people are interlocked together and they're sharing the same space together, here's the glue that pulls them together, the kind of interactional glue.
Great, thank you. Professor Khan, we're running out of time, so
briefly. Yeah, I mean, Ashley and I wrote a piece on theoretical and methodological developments within elites, highlighting how seven different kinds of methods could be used. I think in it, we basically say survey research is going to be really hard for this because of small n problems and problems of recruitment. It's not really going to be that great. That network analysis, probably with existing data and especially administrative data, could be really useful. That within experiments, it's actually really possible and not enough people have done it because you may have problems with the recruitments, but there can be experimental manipulations about resource distributions that can create different levels in between group equality. So some could be relatively equal, some could be really unequal, and that could lead to creative forms of design. And so in that, we kind of like eagerly sort of anticipate a greater integration of this. And within, the field of political science, I think, Ben Page has tried to do some of this a little bit with recruitment and, more or less successful for varieties of reasons. And I think Ashley and I are both kind of methodologically diverse in thinking, actually, it would be better for our work if more of this work were out there, because then we would have more to be in conversation with.
Great. We've got two more questions, and I'm gonna put the two together and then give you each a chance to answer one or both. And then we'll end. So Michael Johnson asks, basically, are there beneficial outcomes or aspects that you observe from having an elite or a privileged class? So do you see any benefits from this? And Charles Johnson, another great question: do universities with multi-billion-dollar endowments or billion-dollar endowments bear responsibilities to better use their endowments to try and reduce the wealth gap? So are there benefits, and are there things universities might be doing? Professor Finn, let's start with you and go around the room.
I'm having a hard time coming up with something nice to say about elite and inequality. I think I have a moral commitment to normative egalitarianism that makes that I'm not coming up with anything. Sorry. Thanks for the question, Michael. And as far as
and I think Michael's asked the question in a way that he agrees with you, so you're on the same page.
Yeah, probably that's true. And then do universities have a responsibility? Woof. What are universities responsible for? What's so tough is I think, universities are one of the main engines of reproduction of cultural capital and social capital and equality in our society. Do they have a responsibility to counteract that? Well, gosh, it would be nice, but clearly they don't, or they would.
Yeah, Shamus, anything to add to so much of what you've said?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, I think the question of elites is not a question of are there groups that have greater resources. It's instead, what is the degree of inequality that there is and what's its character? So how much is the degree of inequality between groups, and how is that inequality produced? And so for me, it's not like you can't observe a society without observing a privileged class. And through looking at them, through looking at exceptional cases, you can learn really particular things. As for universities, I'll just briefly say, yes, they should be more egalitarian, but we often function under the myth that educational institutions are magical institutions. And I mean that in two ways. One, that we park people in them for, kids who are in middle school and elementary school, they spend less than half their waking days in schools, and actually probably closer to about a quarter of their waking time. And we imagine that that should make classism, racism, gender inequality, ableism all disappear. Like, if elite institutions were suddenly to become free, it would have no real effect on American systems of inequality. And I don't think that that means that there isn't a responsibility there, but I think that those of us in educational institutions often imagine the magical transformative capacity of those institutions abstracted from the web of social relations and other organizations that they're embedded within.
Yeah, beautifully put. Ashley, here's the last word for our panel.
Yeah, no, so I agree on that last point, Shamus, that there's no magic bullet for this. At the same time, I think that any institution that has benefited from structural inequality has a duty and a moral obligation to first acknowledge it and then try to rectify it. On the question of this kind of so what, and what are the kind of benefits of the privileged class, I think that there's always inequality in any society, right? That's not what we're not going to end inequality. That exactly as Shamus said, it's the nature of it that should make us interested. And concerning these kinds of elite social spaces that I got into, I think that part of the draw of why people want to get into them is that they are exclusive and that most people are kept out. And yeah, I think that maybe finding greater spaces for plurality is kind of maybe one step forward. Although I think that ending the exclusivity of any kind of social system itself is not really like possible, because that is the social. Anyway, that's a little bit of a weird ending, but
no, we have to confront realities and how we study them. Listen, let me just thank you all. This has been a marvelous hour and a half. Thank the audience for coming, and I wish we could all give you a big round of applause, but hear it in your ears anyway. And we'll have each of you back to Brown, I hope, very soon. Thank you again for coming. This has been just a treat.
Thank you for the conversation. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Yeah, this was great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks all. Bye.